The question that leaps out is, what's Putin up to? I've seen articles just this very day. There are people in Russia who are hoping that he wants to reconstitute something like the Soviet Union. There's another Stalinist now come to prominence on the media. Maybe he wants to reignite the Cold War. So the question is, what is he up to here?
Let me just say this. What he's not, and this is another meme, is crazy. There's a meme out there that somehow Putin has lost his mind. That's not what this is about. Let's go back. Remember, this is one generation ago, 25 years ago, 24 years ago. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ideology absolutely disappeared. Nobody gave a damn about that except for people on the margins. Some old people who still had dreams of communism. But mostly people cared about, if they cared at all, about power, the state. And suddenly it fractured. It fractured into 15 different states, highly various. The Baltic states are tiny, more liberal, tied to Sweden and the West. And then you had other places like Central Asia, which inevitably became far, far more conservative, troubled in many other different ways. The disease of what empire was under the Soviet Union is, and the psychology and nostalgia is still very powerful, even a generation later. Post-imperial nostalgia happened when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, Roman Empire, and it goes on and has political ramifications. Who was Vladimir Putin? He's an ex-KGB man. He was invested in the Soviet Union far more than his two predecessors, who managed to, after all, collapse it. So now you have also a situation where there are many Russians that live outside of the Russian Republic, in northern Kazakhstan, Ukraine, even the Baltic states, Belarus, and so on. And this gives him a pretext to do something that we consider, and I consider, inadmissible, which is to invade a sovereign country. Now, Putin hears that, and he smiles, and he says, where have I heard that before? Invading a sovereign country. I'm not going to accept any lectures on that. So you begin to form a mental universe here. Why Crimea? Because Crimea is heavily Russian. And it was a particular part of Ukraine that Khrushchev, on a seeming whim, in mid-century gave away to Ukraine.
Which didn't mean anything at the time in practice.
It meant less than it does now, because it was all part of the Soviet Union. And like our base in Guantanamo, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia retained military base at the tip, the southern tip of Crimea in Sevastopol. Its fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, is still there. So they watched the events in Ukraine. Putin watched those events in Ukraine in a divided country and felt betrayed.
Just to be clear, the events when Yanukovych was deposed, when a new bunch of people came in Kiev and basically were turning west.
Right. Ukraine is not to oversimplify it, but for just sketch purposes, the eastern and southern part of Ukraine is heavily Russian, and the rest of it is heavily Ukrainian. From a Russian point of view, Ukrainian nationalism is infected also by right-wing and extremist nationalism, even Nazis. But the idea that somehow Nazis were at the forefront of the Ukrainian uprising on Maidan Independence Square is crazy. It's a pretext. This is a very familiar pattern that Putin is using. Russians are crying in for help. Our brothers are in trouble. We go in and help them out. That's the pattern that's going on here. And the vote was just,
Does this suggest that where other Russians are encased, if I can use that word, in now independent countries, we might expect the same thing to happen?
Well, look, 2 weeks before the invasion of Crimea, I would have thought it would be an act of madness, craziness. Now I would think the same about eastern Ukraine. What's happening there? Well, there are troops massing right to the north of eastern Ukraine, near Kharkov and Donetsk and all the rest. So I wish I knew what the barrier of Putin's gall is. I do not.
So the question is, if this is to be a domestic problem for Putin back in Russia, doesn't he have...
It can only be a domestic problem if the West exerts sufficient strength to make it so.
Does the West have the tools to do that?
Look, I think in no way are we talking about a military option, and thank goodness. That's just not on the charts for anybody, and it's just not happening. But the West does have the capacity to exert economic and diplomatic pressure on Russia. Remember, Russia, unlike the Soviet Union, lives in the global world. It lives in the global economy. It sells its oil. It sells its gas. Its very, very wealthy people take their capital and they get it out to the West as fast as they can. They send their kids to Harvard and Columbia and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge. Russians live in the world. If that world suddenly becomes closed to them, then repercussions begin to happen.
This brings us to the question of, if there is pressure of some kind to be exerted from the West, let's look here at home. And I was struck by the headline in yesterday's Times over an op-ed piece by Senator John McCain. Obama made America look weak.
Oh, for God's sake.
Well, let me further annoy you.
Yeah.
Because he says, well,
not that I have any opinions.
He said, you understand he wrote that piece? Not
yeah,
me. Okay.
yeah, I got that. Sorry, Jeff.
No, blaming the messenger. Yeah. I know, of all people.
I know. Because so, you didn't share the winter with us. I
that's
feel
true, right? And
non-fraternal feeling.
Likely never will again.
Yeah, exactly.
And which of us is the dummy?
Okay, no.
Okay. So McCain says, okay, look, I'm certainly not blaming Obama for this. The blame lies with Putin. But, he says, Putin saw a lack of resolve in President Obama. He fed a perception Obama did that America is weak, and people like Mr. Putin, for people like Putin, weakness is provocation.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to their election and where did they first split? On Iraq. Who was right about Iraq, Putin or Barack Obama? Barack Obama is president today.
Putin or McCain?
I'm sorry. Obama is president today because, in large measure, he was right about Iraq. That's where his division with Hillary Clinton came. McCain, and many of us, were wrong. We're wrong. Syria is an incredible, this is the most recent ramification of it.
That's relevant because people like Lindsey Graham and McCain have said,
want to invade everywhere.
Weakness in Syria also helped Putin do this.
Absolutely. I think Syria is the most recent relevant subject here. Now, what is McCain suggesting? He's saying, well, of course it's not Barack Obama's fault. And of course I'm not suggesting we go to war. What I'm suggesting is that we have economic sanctions, which is precisely what's going on. So this is just political nonsense, I have to say. And McCain's sophistication on the Ukrainian question is such that when he went to Kiev, and I'm glad he went to Kiev, that's great, he managed to stand next to a neo-Nazi politician. That's bad advance work. Now, look, I don't doubt the sincerity of John McCain. But I think he's twisting up in knots what policy is in the United States at this moment. I don't know what he's suggesting. If he's not suggesting a military option and economic sanctions are coming into play, it seems to me political gamesmanship. And that's not useful.